All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be Macroeconomics, Chapter 11, and this is Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply Model. So if you have read the chapter and you want to pull out your notes and pause me for a second, and then we'll jump right in. All right, Section 11.1, Macroeconomic Perspectives on Demand and Supply. So we're going to talk about the two main macroeconomic philosophies. This is going to be Say's law and Keynesianism. Later on, in a couple of weeks, I believe we have another economic philosophy course or lecture, and it's going to be on Keynes, Say's, and then we're also going to throw in some Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels on communism. So I guess that would be the third. It's pretty discounted, right? I mean, clearly there are problems with the ideas of communism, but it is worth learning and discussing and at least knowing what Marx and Engels said, because they do have some really interesting points. Okay, so Section 11.1, Macroeconomic Perspectives. First, we have Say's law. Say, Jean-Baptiste Say, is from the 18th century France. This was during sort of the French Revolution. This is sort of the modern, the birth of modern economics. We're just starting to delve into the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and moving away from these former models of how nation states run an economy, largely based on colonialism and on mercantilism, right? Just trying to collect as much specie as possible and bring it back to the homeland, that sort of thing. So we're moving away from that model. We're starting to see the first modern economists sort of poke their heads out. This is going to be John Maynard Keynes, but he's much later in the. It's not John Maynard Keynes, actually. It's going to be Jean-Baptiste Say. It's going to be Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It's going to be, in a sense, Immanuel Kant in Germany. But you're seeing all of these sort of bohemian major urban centers experiencing the birth of the Industrial Revolution, experiencing the birth of the true first labor markets and their consequences, and how sort of the owners of the means of production, as Engels would say, treat their... Oh, man, I have pink fingernails. I keep forgetting. My daughter and my girlfriend and I had a ladies' night the other night, so that's going to be the only mention of it. We had a good time. I probably should explain why I have pink fingernails that are shiny and glittery. Ladies' night pandemic style. I couldn't get out of the house, so we had fun with it. Anyway, back to the birth of the modern economy. We're starting to see the consequences of how the owners of capital and production treat their labor. We're starting to even see the idea of labor as a commodity, right? And as paychecks even are like just starting, really the only paychecks you had were in the artisan class. And then, it may be the soldier class, right? Like they would be given a stipend by like the Roman legions, this sort of thing. But even the concept of a paycheck didn't really exist. The concept of a ubiquitous currency that like everyone in society carries around. It was just, currency was for the elites, and everybody else lived at subsistence level and sort of just grew and made their own goods and bartered, there wasn't much of a real like economy, but we're starting to see the birth of a real modern economy. People have paychecks, currency is flourishing, you're starting to see modern techniques of production and mass production techniques. You're seeing urbanization for the first time. People are moving away from the farms and coming in where the jobs are. So this is just a complete turnover of the former economic system, and everything we've ever known about economics before. Finally, like the lowest of the low are members of the economy now. And so Say comes in, and there are arguments, there are philosophical arguments amongst the budding bohemian class at the time as to what drives economics, what drives a nation's GDP overall, and Say says that it's all about supply, right? If you look at the aggregate economy and not the micro, if you look at the macro, it's all about supply. And Say basically says in a nutshell that production generates income, right? As you're making something in this new economy, your boss has to pay you, and that pay that is now burning a hole in your pocket generates demand somewhere further down the line, right? And so Jean-Baptiste Say is saying that we need to just be ramping up production, right? The French government needs to be investing in production techniques and just producing goods, even if we don't necessarily have a buyer yet, because those paychecks that will be going into the workers and the bosses and the supervisors' hands are going to create demand somewhere else in the economy. And so as we ramp up our production capabilities, we're ramping up our GDP, and demand will simply follow, right? This is what we call the neoclassical perspective now. And Keynesian is the neo-Keynesian perspective. But this supply side Say's law is neoclassicalism. And there are problems, though. This is more of a long-term solution and long-term theoretical model than it is a short-term one, right? Because long-term, we do see growth outweighing slumps by far, right? Supply does tend to generate demand, and we do see long-term growth, right? Where it doesn't really work is in the short term, especially in recessionary periods, right? Because if we have all of these products that we're generating, but no one's buying them because we're in a slump time, the supply clearly is not driving the demand. And so in the short term, this model doesn't necessarily work so well. It's more of a long-term, our economy is rocking at its efficiency. We're at productive efficiency on the demand and supply curve. We're not inside of that, right? So we're producing at our, 100% maximum, and, supply is just going to generate greater demand, and we'll see growth. But sometimes we do see recessions, and sometimes we do see depressions. And that's where John Maynard Keynes steps in. John Maynard Keynes, who was born in the very early 1900s, the late 1800s, is living through the Great Depression and the crash of 1929 and the Dust Bowl that happened because farmers couldn't get access to the resources and the finances they needed to be able to fertilize and seed their fields, and so their fields went fallow, and this created high levels of salt on the top level, which eventually created the dust bowls and mass starvation. And so you see that these things have wildly rolling, strange and unpredictable negative externalities, right? So John Maynard Keynes steps in and he says, we need to be able to understand this stuff. This is devastatingly bad. We've never really seen any sort of depression like this, and Say's law doesn't work. It's not working. It's not because we're not producing stuff, right? We still have massive technological innovation. We still have a huge labor market. We still have all of the technology that we needed. We still have all of the production facilities that we needed. The problem is there's no demand. People are starving and they're scared and they're just stashing their money and they don't want to spend it. And so it's not about Say's vision of supply driving demand. Keynes is saying that in these depressionary periods, what we really need is demand, not supply. We need to artificially generate demand, and that will push the supply up, which eventually will catch up, and Say's law will kick back in, and it'll pull demand toward that productive efficiency curve, right? And so this is the first time that we really are truly starting to understand not just the peaks of the economy, but also the troughs of the economy. And John Maynard Keynes is the first to really set out the logical argument for why this happens and how we can get out of it, right? And this is much of the theoretical and philosophical backing for FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program, where he's just pumping government money into the system to ensure that people have a paycheck and have money to spend, and that will, in the long term, generate demand, which will eventually lead to factories opening back up and labor being hired again, and then eventually Say's law will kick in and start dragging demand with it instead of demand pushing supply. So it worked. FDR was right. There were problems with it, right? No government policy is ever implemented perfectly. That's a human impossibility. But we did drag ourselves kicking and screaming out of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. So Keynes has been vital to our understanding of modern economics, and especially when things go wrong, right? So I think that's enough of that. No, I guess I should discuss the couple of problems, just like Say's. This is not a really accurate depiction of long-term economic growth, right? Economies grow. They tend to be at their production frontier in general, especially in the developed world. And so Keynes's theories, this neo-Keynesian economics, doesn't make a lot of sense on the vast long-term scale. This is more of a short run. When things are going wrong, we need to kick in our theory of Keynesian economics, right? There are also limitations, right? Because if you follow logically, it just suggests that we should be pumping money into the system. Like the U.S. government and every government on Earth should just be kicking as much money as they possibly can to their citizenry, creating demand, which will drive supply, and this will work infinitely. Of course, that's not true, right? Nothing works infinitely. You have reductions in your marginal return, right? And so eventually you pump up against this, like, you could put infinite amount of money more into the system. It's still never going to drive up more demand. The question is, where is that really fine equilibrium point where the government is feeding the perfect amount of money into the system, either through investments or through cash transfers or through welfare programs or through education or through, whatever it is, right? How do we maximize the efficiency of that money? Okay. Section 11.2, building models of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So first, we're going to look at figure 11.3. This is an aggregate supply model. And you'll notice as we start to walk through these that these are very different from the micro supply and demand models. First, the supply model looks similar to the micro supply model and the micro supply graph, but the demand looks very, very different, as you see in 11.4. But we should talk about the graph, right? Because the graph is not about prices, it's about GDP, first of all. What is the total finished good output of the economy in gross domestic product terms? So that's the x-axis. And the y-axis is the price level, right? It's not the actual price. It is the price level of all finished goods in your economy. And as it increases, you're basically saying we're getting inflation. All products are becoming more expensive over time. especially compared to their input prices, because this price level takes that into account, right? Input prices stay the same, and this price level increases over time. And as you can see, the logic is, as you increase your price level, obviously your profit is going to increase if your input costs are equivalent across the board. And so, as your price level increases, companies clearly have an incentive to produce more product, right? And this will drive us up. It will drive us up the GDP. It will drive GDP up, the potential. And the further sort of up the supply curve we are, the closer we are to productive efficiency. Okay. That's enough of that. 11.4. Here you can see aggregate demand. And again, you have GDP across the bottom. It's not prices, and it's not the number of products purchased. These are very aggregate concepts, right? So you have a real GDP across the x-axis, and then you have the price level across the y-axis, not actual prices. It is the price level relative to input costs. Okay, and so as the price level increases, obviously demand is going to drop, right? If it only costs a dollar to produce a gallon of milk, and it costs $3 to buy one, right? The market says we'll buy 1,000. If it costs a dollar to produce and it costs $5 to buy one, now the market says no, we're only going to buy 600, right? So the more profit margin there is in the system, the higher the price level in the system, the lower demand is going to be, right? And this will reduce our GDP. Why do we see demand decrease domestically as the price index increases? Because remember, this is a domestic, United States only graph. This graph right here. We could aggregate it even more, right? And have it on the world stage, world GDP. I don't really know how helpful that would be, right, though. Here we have United States aggregate demand. What happens if price indexes rise? Well, we get the wealth effect, right? The higher prices compared to input prices are going to eat at our savings and are going to eat at our income, and so we'll be able to buy fewer products, period. We'll also have the interest rate effect. This is a very complicated many pieces effect, right? The higher costs for the same goods will mean that it costs more credit to invest, right? So companies are going to need more credit. So that means demand for credit will increase, which means that interest rates will increase. And as interest rates increase, the amount of borrowing in the system drops and you get reduced demand, right? So it's a whole lot, right? Businesses always want to invest, but as things cost more, interest rates go up on how much you're having to pay back when you borrow, and that's going to reduce the amount of spending in the system. And then finally, you have the foreign price effect. And this basically just says that as the relative costs of American goods go up, you're going to start buying elsewhere, right? Because those foreign goods are going to cost relatively less. And so you're going to replace your American purchases generally with foreign purchases, just because you're homo economicus is what they call you. You don't have a philosophy about buy American or any of that stuff. From a rational choice perspective, you just buy what's cheapest for you and your family. So from that theoretical perspective, you'll just start buying foreign goods. All right. 11.6, this is where we stick the two together, and you see that we will actually see our GDP and our price point at the equilibrium point of E, all right? Okay, shifts in aggregate supply. This is section 11.3. The first, figure 11.7a. This is the LRAS curves with the triple curve, right? So what you'll see is that we're at the aggregate demand curve, but our supply is increasing over time. We're moving from equilibrium 0 to equilibrium 1 to equilibrium 2. And what happens when you expand your supply possibilities or your production frontier, you inevitably and theoretically increase your GDP while also reducing your price index, right? So this is a phenomenal thing for any economy. You want to be able to expand your long-run aggregate supply curve. That's your LRAS. I know they use all of these acronyms, but really simple thing. We're just expanding our supply over time in the aggregate economy. And regardless of what happens to demand, demand we're assuming stays the same. And when demand stays the same and you expand your supply frontier, you get expansion in your GDP, so you get economic growth, but you also get a reduction in prices. Okay. How does that happen? This happens by production increases, so your labor becomes more productive, or through a new technology. Generally, these two things sort of meld together, right? A new technology will get you labor productivity increases. But this is what it's about. It's about technological or think of Henry Ford, right? It wasn't necessarily a new invention or anything, but it was a new system of creating products, and that expanded our supply, our long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, when aggregate supply is reduced on the exact opposite of what we just talked about, basically, not only is your GDP going to contract, but your prices are going to increase, which is basically inflation. And so this is a really, really bad thing, because now you're getting stagflation. You're getting not only high levels of inflation, but because GDP is contracting, you're also getting unemployment on the back end. And so this is a really, really bad thing. You've got to avoid this sort of thing. The good thing is it's pretty rare. The only thing that generally causes these sort of supply contractions are massive changes to input prices. So if oil prices skyrocket overnight, sort of thing, or if rare earth materials that were $1 a gram are now $10 a gram, since last week, that can cause serious problems, especially as intricately tied as everything is. But this generally, it doesn't really happen a lot. It's usually like some sort of exogenous shock to the system. Prices skyrocket for a very short while, but then the market corrects itself and they go back to normal. So, you might get a bump in prices for a while, but generally that supply curve goes back to normal productivity. And then I put a little note in here. Just remember that this is the Say's neoclassical argument of GDP. This is all about supply and how supply affects GDP and GDP size, GDP growth or contraction, and prices and demand and all of these things, right? So this is all the Say's neoclassicist side of the argument. Okay, and then we'll move to the other side of the argument. This is the Keynesian or neo-Keynesian perspective of the demand side of the argument, and how demand can drive supply and GDP growth and things of that sort, especially during bad times, like I was saying earlier. Okay, so remember, keep in mind that there are 4 different components of demand. These are going to be consumption. What can affect consumption? Generally, this is going to be consumer confidence or business confidence, for which we have many different markers and measures. What affects business and consumer confidence? Exogenous shocks, like we were talking about earlier, shocks to the system. Wars can do this. Growth. If your economy is growing smoothly, you're going to have higher business and consumer confidence, and therefore demand will be higher. Elections can affect it. If there's fear of a new government coming in and changing all the laws, or I know in America, the sort of business community tends to be skeptical of the Democratic Party and some of the laws that they might implement concerning labor laws and concerning wages and minimum wages and all of this. So there is a little bit of fear in the market, and that can cause contractures in the demand side, right? I would also say environmental shocks. These could be things like drought, which could affect the cost of inputs. And it could also be things like, say, a tsunami, or like the Fukushima disaster in Japan where their nuclear reactor exploded. People freak out about that sort of thing, and it can cause massive disruptions in the supply chains and in the logistics networks and in all of these different things. So there are exogenous shocks from all over the world that can affect demand and expectations of business and consumer confidence. Does that make sense? God, I wish you guys were actually in front of me so I could actually talk to you about whether that makes sense or not. Other stock market crashes can affect consumer confidence. So in 1997, there was a massive crash on the Asian stock market. South Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, Malaysia, they all sort of took a really big hit all within like a 30-day period. A lot of the rest of the world's economy contracted a little bit, especially in like Chile, Argentina, the US economy a little bit, the Nikkei in Japan. So there, you know, things aren't as compartmentalized as they used to be because of globalization, because of instantaneous news, and because of access to information about what's happening all over the world. These instantaneous exogenous shocks can affect consumer and business confidence and can affect your aggregate demand. Okay. All right, investment. This is sort of tied into just above, right? And this is tied into the business confidence side of it. Does the business expect to get good return on investment? If they don't, they're going to reduce their investment, right? They're going to reduce their investment in equipment, in technology, in research and development. It's all about your expectations about the future, right? Part of this is also the reduction in brick and mortar companies. There's a lot less incentive for companies to build brick and mortar, business, retail fronts, this sort of thing, because of the ubiquity of Amazon and eBay and all of these alternative online retailers. So we're also seeing a slight downtick in the investment piece of aggregate demand because of the expectation by businesses of the death of brick and mortar. Okay. All right, government expenditures. This can vary wildly, right? Especially in a two-party system like we have. And generally, liberals tend to spend more money through the government, and generally, Republicans tend to reduce expenditures through the government. In modern times, that's not really true. George Bush II spent a crap load of money, and Donald Trump had one of the biggest deficits of all time. And apparently Joe Biden's going to do the same thing. So it looks like fiscal hawks don't really exist anymore. That's all mouthpiece, right? We will see long term whether that's true, but for the past 25, 30 years, it's just all been talk. There's no actual fiscal hawks. They just use it as a political tool. But we have enormous deficits. And as we learned last time, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If we're investing it, if we're using it to expand our production, if we're using it to expand our human resources, but it can be a bad thing if we're just wasting it, right? So, fiscal hawks aren't really real anymore. I guess that would be one thing I would say. Spending theoretically would be reduced under conservatives, but I think now what really happens is just the shift in where the spending happens, right? So nowadays, Democratic Party is more likely to use cash transfers, social safety net programs, research and development, whereas conservatives are more likely to use it for the military, police, things of that sort. So it's just different philosophies on where the money should be spent. But I don't think anyone anymore is saying, like, stop spending government money, because that's not true. If you look at the facts, it's just simply not true. I would also note that the New Deal arguably got us through the Great Depression. Enormous government spending. Government spending isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? And we'll talk about sort of it later in this chapter in a little while about when government spending is good, right, under Keynesian conditions, as we've seen, and when government spending could be pretty much unnecessary, and that's when you're in the really good times. And I'm not saying kill government spending altogether, but it's probably a little less efficient and more wasteful during good times, during the sort of neoclassical periods, than it is during the neo-Keynesian, scary Depression era kind of periods, right? So just be careful. Again, I like to teach you, just be skeptical and think of all of the little pieces, right? It's not just government spending is always bad. That's silly and really misinformed, and not true, right? You need to understand how government spending can be good at particular times and can be bad at other times, right? And let's understand those different times and situations. So we'll talk about all that too, but know that there are times, like probably right now, where government spending can be a very good thing and can save you from massive economic collapse, or massive readjustments of your aggregate demand, which can cause inflation, unemployment, all of these things, right? And so investing now and ensuring that your economy doesn't shrink could actually be very, very beneficial in the long run. Even if you're not actually growing, you're not losing. And it takes a lot longer to get back to where we were, and then move forward than just keep it here, and then we'll move, So right now, I would argue we're in the sort of neo-Keynesian period of where we need to be pumping money into the system. And I think most economists are in agreement with me. Okay, tax cuts and increases will be the last piece of this sort of government expenditures. Taxation policy can affect other things like consumption, like investment, and government spending, right? I would say, I guess one thing that I've learned and a lot of economists warn is that politicians love to cut taxes, but that's not necessarily always a good thing, right? And the problem is, once you cut them, they're really hard to get back because they're really unpopular. And so the more we just degrade our tax base, the worse things are getting. You're seeing that we don't really have the ability to fight our environmental problems like our hurricanes and wildfires. You're seeing our public utilities collapse in places like Texas and Minnesota where people are dying of cold. You're seeing bridges collapse and dams collapse. A bridge collapsed about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little longer, in Minnesota and killed hundreds of people. A dam collapsed in Tennessee and flooded the valley and killed a bunch of people. These are real issues that people don't really think about. And these are all things that the private market cannot provide or will not provide. And so there are things that the government must provide because they won't come from anyone else. And the more we degrade our tax base, The worse our society gets, the worse our schools get, the worse our infrastructure gets, the worse our utilities get. And so I'm not necessarily saying just throw money at the problem, but I don't think taking money from it is the answer either. So that's going to be my last piece of soapbox for that one. All right, and then lastly, we have our trade balance, which is exports minus imports. This can slightly affect aggregate demand because, like I said, you might move your demand to international companies and foreign products if American products become too expensive, but it's really a very, very small piece of aggregate demand, so we're going to kind of just move on. Okay, and then the graphic here, figure 11.8, I just want you to notice that when you move aggregate demand further and you increase the economy, your GDP increases, but so do your prices. So this leads to inflationary tendencies, right? But as we've learned a little bit, inflation really isn't much of a problem anymore. So these things tend to be controlled. So we'd rather see the growth and the small amount of inflation than not. Excuse me. The second one is if aggregate demand is reduced, right? We have less business confidence and consumer confidence and less spending in the system in general. You're going to see a reduction in your GDP, and then you're also going to see deflationary tendencies where the price index drops, okay? We're going to skip 11.5. I'd love for you guys to read through that, but we've discussed all of this different stuff before, so we're going to move on. To the very last section, Keynes' law and Say's law in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This is where I want to talk about where government expenditure comes in and things like that, okay? So, as I touched on earlier, government expenditure can be far more efficacious during particular economic times, right? And this is during the Keynesian zone. This is where aggregate demand is really low, and we have too much supply in the market, and GDP is sort of collapsing, and in order to move the economy forward and to start to reach our productive capacity, we need to be pumping demand into the system. It's not about supply. We could put as much supply into the system as we want, but no one's buying those products, right? And so you need to pump demand into the system. And so this is the New Deal FDR perspective. This is the sort of the new Joe Biden $1.9 trillion COVID package perspective, right? This is the idea that demand is really low because consumer confidence is low. There's a lot of fear about the future. There's a lot of fear about inflationary tendencies. There's a lot of fear about unemployment. And so people are just stashing away their money. Some people don't really have any money because unemployment is so high. And so if we just give them money and generate manufactured demand, it will cause supply to sort of catch up to the system. It will increase the likelihood that firms will hire employees so that they can start to produce more supply for the system. And that Say's law will eventually start to kick in once we meet that intermediate zone right there, you see? Okay. Now, we're going to shift through the intermediate zone. We're going to pretend, because here it could go either way. Like, sort of pick your poison. Do you want to spend or do you not want to spend? Do you want to focus on consumer growth? Do you want to focus on government expenditures? Blah, blah, blah. Here we're in this sort of this shady area. It could go either way. Once you move past that, through the Keynesian zone and then through the intermediate zone, we get to the neoclassical area where this is about supply, right? And this is about now the government should probably be spending their money on research and development, in reducing taxes for businesses, in infrastructure expenditures and things of that sort, right? Where we increase supply and pull demand with us to bolster GDP, rather than spending money and trying to create demand, because the demand's already there, right? And now we want to try to push forward the production capacity of our society. And so you want to get very different types of government spending, right? and very different types of even investiture spending and investments and things of this sort. So just remember, there are different pieces and there are different philosophies that fit in different economic times. That's what I want you to take from this lecture. I also want to note that I will have a lecture review and a short paper review out either tonight or early in the morning. And then for those of you who emailed me complaining about the exam being due on a Friday on spring break, I would retort that it was there for 2 straight weeks and that you left it until Friday of spring break, didn't you? So get your calendar in order and prepare better in the future and look to yourself in blaming your own frustrations. All right? Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.